All right, here we go with Chapter 7, Learning Disabilities and Attention Deficit Disorder, and Language. Right? Preschoolers experience incidental learning. So they do a lot of play, they do stories, they do, just kind of circle time and talk. And through talking and play and experiences, that's how they learn. Things start to change, like we've talked about before. As soon as the child goes into kindergarten, they're seated in a desk. In grades K to 2, children learn basic skills for reading and writing. They're going to learn phoneme, grapheme correspondences. So phonemes, the sounds, graphemes, the letters, how they go together. So, what sounds go with the letter S, for example. They're going to start to learn how to spell, and they're going to start to decode for reading comprehension. So they're really learning to read here, but the idea so they're learning to read, and then, a little bit of remembering what they're saying. But in K to 2, the emphasis is on learning how to read. In grades 3 and 4, a curricular leap occurs where you're now reading to learn. So you better know how to decode, because now you're reading in order to learn content areas. You're reading in order to learn social studies. You're reading in order to learn science. You're reading in order to learn important skills. So if you haven't mastered decoding, by the end of grade 2, beginning of grade 3, things are going to get really, really hard. Then in grades 5 and 6, the emphasis is on the acquisition of those content areas. The decoding skills, if they weren't already, have to be fully automatic, or it's going to take way too long to read. You're going to be focusing on the reading and not be able to remember what you've read because you're working so hard on just the decoding reading part, right? So it's going to be really difficult. You're going to move to middle school and high school. There's a lot of cognitive development going on, thinking about a lot more complex thoughts. There are more subjects. We get into foreign languages here in the US. We get into higher level science, higher level history, English, literature, all kinds of things. Abstract reasoning. So thinking about, hypotheses for things that haven't happened. Analysis and synthesis of material, and multiple points of view and alternate hypotheses. So understanding that different people, from history had different points of view, why they did what they did, why they may have felt it worked or didn't work, right? It's not just about one thing. It's about multiple things, multiple people. Things get really, really complicated. Difficulties in the acquisition and or use of listening, speaking, reading, writing, reasoning, and or math abilities is going to be the definition of a learning disability. But it's really those disorders of language that are the defining feature of kids with learning disabilities. According to the DSM-5, the definition of specific learning disorder has subcategories for reading, writing, and math. Children with language disorders, attention deficits, memory deficits, and or organizational difficulties. And so, you've got, not all of those are about language, but boy, if you have a memory deficit, that's going to impact your language. And if you have a language impairment, that might impact, your memory, especially as far as memory of things you've read, things you've written. So a lot of these learning problems involve language, or if they don't directly involve language, they can be helped with direct language therapy. For most children, the cause of learning disabilities is unknown, just like pretty much everything in our field and in all of medicine, really. However, kids with learning disabilities are more likely to be low birth weight, to be premature, to have other medical complications at birth, especially things like loss of oxygen, to be late talkers, to have a family history of learning disability and or language disorders. These children are more likely to experience early brain damage, visual or motor deficits, letter or number reversals, phonological disorders, ear infections. These kids are going to have high rates of allergies. Teachers and parents are going to report that these kids are going to be more likely to report headaches, and these kids are going to be more likely to be late talkers than their peers. These are going to be kids that are really at risk. So over a third of kids with learning disabilities and right at a third of kids with speech disorders never finish high school. Now that isn't as high as, more than half of kids with emotional disturbances will drop out, but it's still really high. Even though there aren't a lot of suicides for young children, half of suicides for 10 to 14-year-olds are from kids who are hyperactive, have perceptual impairments, and or have language disorder or dyslexia. Kids with learning disabilities are going to be less likely to have friends, to report they have no one to talk to be diagnosed with depression, to experience low self-esteem, and they're much more likely to be teased and bullied through school. And what's hard for kids with learning disability is that kids who have a more direct or a more straightforward speech and language disorder are often identified prior to entering kindergarten. So if they're in preschool, or even if they're at home with their parents, right, and they're late talkers or really having a hard time with articulation, phonology, anything like that, they're going to get identified. Kids with learning disabilities usually aren't identified until after they're in school. They've been able to kind of get by. They've been the low average kids. Some people call these the almost but not quite kids. So they almost really get what you're talking about, but not quite. These are the kids that might be labeled academic underachievers, maybe kids that are labeled as not working hard enough, but they're kids that have a learning disability. So we need to ask ourselves, how much does a language impairment impact the child academically and or socially, and how much does it impact reading and writing? And lots of times it's to a great deal, right? These are going to be really involved and have a big impact on social life, academic life, reading and writing.